When winter folds over a quiet mountain town, some stories refuse to be buried beneath the snow. Tonight, I want to share with you a true tale of loyalty, mystery, and a German shepherd who would not let silence win. Imagine a funeral where grief hangs heavy, candles flicker, and all hearts ache for a fallen officer. And then imagine a single bark that shatters the stillness and changes everything. That moment revealed a secret that stunned everyone into tears and reminded us that miracles sometimes arrive on four paws. Before we begin, let me ask you this. Where in the world are you watching from? Please leave a comment and let me know. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be shared, tap subscribe to support the channel so these moments of courage and love can reach more hearts. Winter had clamped down on Maplewood Ridge so long and so hard that people had stopped asking when it would end and started moving through it like another law of nature. The little mountain town crouched in a bowl of fir-covered slopes, houses wearing soft white caps of snow, chimneys exhaling thin ribbons of smoke that vanished into a low gray sky. On Main Street, the plows had pushed the drifts into tall frozen berms, carving a narrow path for the slow, respectful line of cars that pulled up to the only funeral home in town. Outside the building, under the amber haze of street lamps, snow fell in small, patient flakes, landing on dark coats, peaked hats, and the squared shoulders of uniforms lined up in silence. The sign above the door read, Harrington and Sons. But tonight it felt less like a business and more like a small, fragile shelter against a world that could take a man in a storm and not give him back. Inside, the air smelled of floor polish, old wood, and the faint sweetness of pine from the wreaths that framed the front of the chapel. Soft yellow light brushed the faces of the mourners and glowed against the smooth curve of the flag-draped coffin resting on its stand. Beside it sat a German shepherd in a black K9 vest, his muscles still but his attention razor-sharp. Ranger was in his prime, about 6 years old, large but not bulky, with the kind of build that spoke of long hours of training rather than show. His coat was a deep saddle of black over warm tan, the fur along his shoulders slightly longer and rougher, as if every winter wind that had ever hit this town had left its fingerprints there. His eyes were dark amber, intelligent and steady, always moving, always measuring. Off duty he could be playful, nudging a ball toward a kid or gently stealing a sock from the laundry basket at home. But tonight there was nothing of that in him. The name tag on his collar caught the light each time he shifted his weight, but his gaze never left the coffin. On the easel near the head of the casket stood a framed photograph of Officer Jack Callahan, a broad-shouldered man in his mid-30s, with laugh lines at the corners of his eyes and a stubborn cowlick that never quite stayed tamed under his winter cap. In the picture, he wore his heavy-duty jacket and had one arm looped easily around Ranger's neck, the other lifted in a wave toward whoever had been behind the camera. His smile suggested a man who trusted the world to be mostly good, as long as someone was willing to stand a post when it wasn't. That smile was now frozen under glass, the man himself lying motionless beneath the flag he had served. In the front row sat his wife, Sarah Callahan. She was the kind of woman people in Maplewood Ridge described as quiet strong when they thought she couldn't hear them. In her early 30s, she had a slender frame made for movement rather than fragility, the subtle muscles in her forearms speaking of someone who lifted more than grocery bags. Her dark brown hair, woven into a loose braid, fell over the shoulder of a simple black dress that did nothing to hide how pale she'd become these past few days. She was of average height, but she carried herself tall, as if she'd learned early that the world respected a straight spine. Sarah worked at the town's small elementary school as a counselor, the person children were sent to when they drew storms instead of houses or flinched at the sound of raised voices. She had a talent for listening without crowding, for finding the one question that opened a door instead of building another wall. That talent had been shaped by her own childhood. Her father, a firefighter, had died when she was 11, taken by another winter like this one, and another building that had seemed solid until it failed. The memory of the knock on the door and the way her mother's shoulders folded had never faded. It had made Sarah wary of sirens, but it had also carved out a deep, stubborn tenderness in her, a refusal to turn away from hurt, no matter how much it scared her. That tenderness was stretched to a breaking point now, as she sat with her hands clenched around a folded tissue, knuckles white, jaw set in a careful line. She greeted people with small nods and soft thank yous, but the part of her that used to fill a room with easy warmth now felt distant, tucked away somewhere she couldn't reach just yet. At the lectern stood the town chaplain, Reverend Michael Avery, a man in his late 50s with a face lined by both laughter and late-night hospital visits. His thinning gray hair was combed back with the distracted care of someone who had long ago stopped worrying about appearances and started worrying more about the weight in people's eyes. His black suit was a little shiny at the elbows, his hands broad and capable, as he rested them on the worn leather cover of his Bible. Avery had buried farmers and teachers, old men who'd seen 3 wars and babies who'd barely opened their eyes. He carried all those funerals in the quiet gravity of his posture. His voice, when he spoke, wrapped around the room with steady gentleness. "We are gathered here tonight to honor a son, a husband, a friend, and a guardian of this town." The phrases rose and fell, a slow tide of comfort that most people heard more with their hearts than their ears. Ranger let out a low whine. It was soft, barely more than a thread of sound, and several people in the front rows assumed it was grief given voice. A few officers glanced toward him with sympathetic eyes. More than one of them had seen the way Ranger's world had shrunk the night they brought Jack's body down from the ridge. Sarah glanced down at him, managing a fragile, crooked smile meant to say, "I miss him too, boy." But Ranger's body language told a different story. His head tilted slightly, ears pricked forward in that sudden, intense stillness working dogs had when something slipped into their awareness that others missed. His nostrils flared, drawing in the air above the polished wood, filtering layers of wax and pine and fabric and something else. The chapel was warm, the heating vents hummed softly, and the coffin had only been fully closed less than an hour ago. The room held the exhalations of dozens of human beings, the faint powder of snow melting from coats, the ghost of perfume and starch. Under all that, something thin and fragile threaded the air, something only a nose like Ranger's would ever recognize. Avery's words faltered for half a second as his eyes flicked toward the dog. The silence that followed felt not like a mistake, but like the room itself had paused to listen along. He cleared his throat and found his place again, but the rhythm had shifted, as if an invisible hand had brushed against the moment and smudged the edges. Ranger stood. The sound was small, a rustle of nylon vest, the click of claws against polished wood. But in the hushed chapel, it sounded almost inappropriate, like laughter in a library. A few heads turned. Snow tapped faintly at the high windows, a delicate percussion that made the dog's movement seem louder by contrast. Outside, the world was muffled and buried. Inside, every sound was suddenly precise. Ranger took 2 measured steps toward the coffin, his body low but controlled, tail held straight rather than wagging. His eyes locked on the narrow seam where the lid met the base, his nostrils working in short, deep draws. Someone near the aisle, Officer Jensen, a younger cop with a too big uniform and a heart that hadn't yet learned how to sit through funerals, whispered, "Ranger, easy boy," and half reached for the leash clipped loosely to the dog's vest. Ranger didn't even flick an ear in his direction. His focus was a steel wire drawn taut between himself and that seam of wood. He pressed his nose against it, inhaling, the breath steaming faintly against the varnish. The muscles along his shoulders trembled, not with fear, but with a coiled urgency that seemed to tighten with every second. The grief that had weighed him down when he entered the room was still there, but it had moved to the background, replaced by something older and simpler, the instinct to respond when the world whispered, "Something is wrong." His posture changed. Anyone who had worked with him in the field would have recognized it instantly, the shift from sorrowing companion to active K9 on alert. His front feet braced slightly wider, his chest lifted, ears forward, gaze sharpening to a pinpoint. Whatever he smelled, whatever pattern his brain had locked onto, it crossed some invisible line inside him, from maybe to must. Ranger's jaw parted, breath drawing in once more. And then, slicing through the chaplain's gentle cadence and the rustle of tissues and the damp weight of winter grief, came a single sound that did not belong at a funeral. He barked. It was not a confused yelp or a wounded cry. It was a sharp, explosive report from deep in his chest, the kind of bark that officers heard on raids, on searches. in that slim heartbeat between danger and action. It cracked against the high ceiling and ricocheted off the frame photographs, startling several people to their feet. A woman in the third row flinched and grabbed her husband's arm. Someone in the back muttered, "What on earth?" under their breath. "Ranger!" Officer Jensen hissed again, face flushing as if he himself had broken the invisible rule of funeral quiet. His hand tightened on the leash, but he didn't quite pull. Even he could feel that something beyond bad manners was unfolding. Up front, Sarah's heart leapt painfully against her ribs. She had heard that bark in 100 different contexts. Through the open window when Jack and Ranger trained in the yard. Over the radio when a call went dicey and someone muttered, "K9's engaged," in the background. Never here. Never inches from her husband's coffin. Her fingers dug into the damp tissue in her palm as she stared at the dog. Ranger ignored every pair of human eyes on him. He stepped closer to the coffin, nose traveling along the seam in small, precise movements, as if tracing an invisible line that only he could see. His breath came quicker now, the fine hairs around his muzzle quivering. The world had narrowed for him, to the scent pressed into the fibers of cloth and wood, to something fragile and unfamiliar, and yet important in a way his training did not cover, but his heart insisted it did. For a heartbeat, the entire chapel seemed to hang in a strange balance. Grief on one side, and on the other, the hum of a new tension no one yet understood. The chaplain's Bible lay closed against the lectern, his fingers resting still on its cover. Snow drifted past the high windows, soft and relentless, as if measuring time in flakes instead of seconds. Ranger stopped moving. He planted his front paws, muscles rigid, leaned his weight into the wood as far as his sense of respect would allow, and filled his lungs. Somewhere inside that coffin, beneath layers of flag and fabric and human assumption, something answered his question in a language only a dog could hear. The second bark, when it came, was not louder than the first, but it was different, focused, demanding, not a sound of mourning, but of warning, of insistence. The kind of sound that said to every human in the room, whether they spoke dog or not, "Do not go on as if everything is normal. Look here, now." Conversations froze in throats, tissues stilled halfway to eyes. Even the furnace seemed to hush. And in that stunned silence, with winter pressing its cold face against the windows and the town of Maplewood Ridge holding its breath, a single thought, half fear, half bewilderment, passed like a shiver through the room. What could a dog possibly know about a closed coffin? That they didn't. The story of Jack Callahan's funeral had been meant to end with folded flags and final words, but as Ranger's bark hung in the air, sharp and unyielding, it was suddenly, unmistakably clear. Whatever this night was, the story wasn't over yet. For a moment after Ranger's bark struck the chapel like a thunderclap, the entire room existed in a strange, suspended stillness, like a painting in which everyone had frozen mid-emotion. Then, reactions began to ripple outward, a startled intake of breath here, the creak of a pew there, a dropped program fluttering to the floor. Someone muttered, "What's gotten into him?" in a voice wobbling between irritation and unease. But Ranger, he didn't care. He wasn't listening to them. His whole world had narrowed to that seam in the coffin again. Officer Mark Delaney was halfway down the aisle before he realized he had even gotten to his feet. Mark was in his late 30s, solidly built, with a runner's strong legs and a square jaw that made him look vaguely carved from oak. He had been Jack's closest friend on the force, his academy buddy, his shift partner, his backup on long dark nights and blinding snowstorms. Mark was usually reserved, steady, thoughtful before he spoke, but right now his heart was hammering against his ribs with a feeling that had no name yet. He knelt beside Ranger. "Hey, what's going on, boy?" His voice came out rougher than he intended. His hand rested on Ranger's back, and he could feel the tension there, every muscle tuned like a wire, vibrating, ready. This wasn't panic. This wasn't confusion. This was intention. Ranger sniffed again, short, rapid inhalations, then sharply tapped the coffin with his right paw. It made a scraping noise against the polished wood, harsh and shocking in the reverent room. Several older mourners winced. "Get that dog under control," snapped a voice from the side. The speaker was Arthur Pendleton, a retired police sergeant now in his 70s, with a rigid posture, grizzled mustache, and eyebrows like storm clouds. He wore a dark wool overcoat buttoned to the throat, and he had always believed funerals required strict decorum. Unfortunately, he believed dogs were for hunting fields and barns, not inside rooms with mahogany furniture and folded flags. Mark turned his head slightly, eyes narrowing. Ranger's trained. If he's acting like this, there's a reason. But even as he said it, he wasn't prepared for what came next. Ranger moved around to the long side of the coffin, nose gliding along the seam, and he barked again, once, deep and urgent. The kind of bark he used on the field when he'd found a living scent. Sarah, sitting rigid in the front row, felt her stomach twist. She wasn't a police officer, but she had lived beside one long enough to know this was not a bark of grief. This was a bark of insistence. Reverend Avery closed his Bible and spoke gently. Perhaps Ranger senses something we do not. Someone in the back scoffed, but softly. Nobody wanted to loudly contradict a chaplain in a funeral home. Mark laid both palms on the coffin and leaned his ear to the wood. He wasn't sure why he did it, only that it felt right. He held his breath. The world shrank. The ticking of the wall clock disappeared. The rustle of clothes, the sniffles, the faint sighs, all faded. At first, he heard nothing. Then, something. A scritch. A faint, irregular movement. Something impossibly soft. He jerked back, eyes wild. Then he said words that shattered the ceremony like a dropped mirror. "There's something alive in there." The reaction was immediate. "What? Alive? Oh, Lord." The funeral director, Mr. Felix Harrington, was suddenly very pale beneath his thin comb-back of hair. Felix was a meticulous man in his 40s, tall, slightly stooped, known for running his funeral home with quiet professionalism. He wore a dark gray suit and white gloves. He always wore them when handling caskets, a habit passed down from his father. But now those gloves trembled. "Officer Delaney, there must be some mistake. The body was prepared, sealed." Mark stood, voice like a blade. "Open it." Felix stammered. "Sir, I can't just. There are protocols, legal procedures." Mark stepped closer, eyes fierce. "Felix, if there is something living in that coffin and you leave it in there, we're looking at criminal negligence." Felix swallowed hard. From the front row came another voice, steady, thin, worn raw by grief, but built on deeper strength. Sarah stood. "Open it," she said. Her voice was quiet. Her voice was absolute. Felix's shoulders sagged. "Very well." He hurried to the head of the coffin, fumbling with the silver clasps. Two attendants joined him, a young woman named Katie Lopez, who had only worked at the funeral home for 6 months, and an older attendant, Gary Turner, who had seen dozens of services, but never anything like this. Meanwhile, Ranger stood completely still, every fiber locked into focus. His breathing was fast, but controlled. His eyes flicked back and forth, waiting. The lid lifted with a slow, weighted creak. Several people gasped. Sarah braced herself. She expected to see her husband's face again. But Ranger didn't look at the body. He stood on his hind legs, paws braced against the coffin's edge, and peered inside. His ears tilted forward like arrowheads. Mark stepped beside him and looked too. And there it was. Something tiny. Something trembling. Something warm and alive. Nestled against the chest of Jack Callahan, within the folds of his uniform jacket, was a newborn puppy, barely larger than a man's hand, fur damp, eyes closed, breath weak. A hush swept the room, as though the snow itself had pressed against the windows to listen. Mark reached in with careful hands and lifted the tiny creature. The puppy's heart fluttered like a trapped bird beneath his palms. She let out a thin, trembling whimper. Someone cried openly. Someone whispered, "Dear God!" Sarah's hands flew to her mouth, tears spilling faster than she could wipe them. Ranger leaned close, inhaled deeply, then gently touched his nose to the pup's head. He did it with reverence. He did it with recognition. Because he had smelled this life inside the coffin. Because he knew it wasn't over. Because he had refused to sit still and watch a miracle suffocate. Through her tears, Sarah whispered, "Jack, what did you do?" And though no one answered, every person in the room felt the same truth settle in the hush like snow. Jack Callahan had died trying to keep something else alive, and Ranger had just saved it. The funeral chapel had become something entirely different from what it had been an hour earlier. It was no longer a quiet room of endings, but a thundering crossroads of shock, disbelief, and something that almost felt like resurrection. People moved in low, stunned murmurs. Some stood, some sat again, some hovered awkwardly between the two, unsure of what to do with their hands or their eyes. But in the center of it all stood Mark, holding the tiny pup against his chest. The little creature was fragile, damp fur sticking up in disordered tufts, belly rising and falling in quick, shallow pulses. Mark could feel her heartbeat tapping frantically against his palms, like she was knocking on the world, insisting, "I am here. Don't stop." The nurse who stepped forward was someone known around town, Margaret Hill, early 40s, red-haired, freckled, with a kindly demeanor that concealed a spine of iron. She worked at Northwood Clinic, and though she was calm, competent, and soothing by nature, she was also known for the exact manner in which she could snap orders when patients were in danger and time was short. "Give her to me," Margaret said gently. "Careful now." Mark transferred the pup into Margaret's waiting hands. Ranger stood close enough that his flank touched Mark's knee, eyes fixed on the small bundle in Margaret's arms. Margaret checked the pup like she would check a newborn child, 2 fingers behind the jawline, ear pressed lightly against the ribs. "She's breathing quickly, stress and cold," she said, voice low but steady. She opened her coat and tucked the puppy inside, against the warmth of her body heat. "She needs warmth, slowly, gradually. She's not far from hypothermia." A murmur of relief and worry swept through the crowd. Sarah was standing now, hands trembling, eyes wet. Is she going to be all right?" "We'll do everything we can," Margaret replied. But Ranger was still staring into the coffin, nose working, ears pricked. Something remained unfinished. Mark leaned over the open casket again. Jack's uniform jacket had been carefully arranged by the funeral attendants earlier, but now, slightly disturbed by the discovery of the pup, something slipped loose from an inner pocket, a folded sheet of paper. It fluttered downward like a leaf shaken loose by wind. Mark caught it. He froze. His eyes widened, not because of the paper itself, but because of what was written on the outside. Sarah. The name was written in long, deliberate strokes. The handwriting was absolutely Jack's. Mark had seen that handwriting on incident reports, birthday cards, sticky notes taped to lunch boxes, and sign-in sheets at the station. The moment Mark held that letter, the room seemed to contract, like its walls pulled closer to hear. He turned to Sarah. He didn't even lift the letter, just held it at waist height. "This is for you." Sarah stared at the paper as though it might vanish if she moved too suddenly. I can't." Mark nodded, not questioning. "Then I'll read it." Ranger stepped closer, almost between Sarah and Mark, like he understood that what was about to be read was not just for ears, but for hearts. Mark unfolded the first crease carefully, then the next. The note was written in blue ink, edges damp from proximity to the puppy's body. Mark cleared his throat and read Jack's words into the air. "If you're seeing this, it means I didn't make it back from that call." People in the room bowed their heads, as if those words themselves were sacred. Sarah closed her eyes. She had prepared herself for grief, but not for Jack speaking again, across the threshold of death. "I don't know exactly what you've been told, but know this, I wasn't alone." Ranger's ears twitched. "The snow was coming down so hard, I could barely see my own hands. Ranger stayed with me, like he always does." Mark's voice wavered, only slightly, but enough that several people looked up. "We found something out there, someone tossed aside like trash, a newborn pup, barely breathing." Margaret's arms tightened around the tiny creature against her chest. "I put her inside my jacket so she could feel some kind of warmth. Ranger pressed against us to keep the wind off." At those words, Ranger let out a soft, deep whine. He remembered. He remembered the storm, the desperation, the weight of his body shielding that tiny flame of life. "I don't know how long we stayed like that. only that every time I thought I was fading, I felt her move and knew I had to hold on a little longer. Sarah cried openly now, no longer silent tears, but the trembling sobs of a woman whose heart was breaking and healing at the same time. If this letter is being read, it means I ran out of a little longer. A shiver passed through the room. If, by any mercy of God, Ranger made it back, and the pup too, I'm asking one last thing. Mark's voice softened, but the words carried like a prayer. Don't let them be separated. Ranger looked up into Mark's eyes. Ranger understands more than people think. He knows who she is. A few people gasped softly. He knows who she is. Let him watch over her. Let them heal each other. Mark stopped. The final line was short. The ink looked shakier there, as if Jack's hand had been losing strength. I trust you, Jack. When Mark folded the letter closed, the silence in the room was profound, deeper than any hush they'd held for the funeral itself. Tears had become common, flowing freely and unashamed. Felix Harrington, the funeral director, normally so reserved, distant, almost clinical, took off his white gloves and wiped his eyes. He didn't apologize for it. Mark placed the letter gently into Sarah's hands. Her fingers closed around it like she was holding something, impossibly precious and impossibly fragile. She whispered, voice shaking, "That man lived his whole life trying to save others, and in the end, he still was." Then she looked down at Ranger. He looked up at her. Something passed between them, not just grief, but recognition. Purpose. Margaret spoke gently. I need to get this little one somewhere warm, soon. She needs heat, fluids, possibly glucose. I'll go with you, Sarah said quickly, wiping her face with the back of her hand. Please, Mark nodded. I'll drive you both. Sarah hesitated, only a moment, then looked to Ranger. You're coming too, boy. Ranger thumped his tail once, the first sign of movement beyond duty since the whole thing began. The crowd parted for them. People stepped back, bowing heads, whispering, watching. Margaret carrying the pup, Sarah holding the letter, Mark walking beside them, Ranger leading with steady steps. Behind them, the coffin of Jack Callahan remained, but something had shifted. He was no longer simply the man they mourned. He was the man who had used his last breaths to protect new life. And as the door opened and the cold air rushed in, Ranger looked back one last time over his shoulder, not at the coffin, not at the folded flag, but at the place where Jack Callahan had stood in life, and where his final wish was still echoing into the world. Later that evening, long after candles had burned down in the chapel and the last of the mourners left with stunned hearts, the storm outside Maplewood Ridge returned with a vengeance. Snow that had been falling lazily all afternoon now slashed sideways on fierce gusts of wind, tumbling down the empty streets and piling in white dunes against porch rails and church steps. The town looked as if someone had drawn a white curtain across it, leaving warm yellow windows as the only proof of human life. Inside Sarah Callahan's small kitchen, the contrast could not have been sharper. Warm lamplight glowed against wooden cabinets. The stove hummed softly. And in a woven basket near the baseboard, Heater slept the tiny pup, now gently warmed, loosely wrapped in a pale baby blanket. The rapid breathing that once shuddered through her body had become slower, steadier. Now, merely the whisper of a fragile life beginning to trust its fragile new safety. Ranger lay beside the basket, stretched out along the floorboards like a silent sentinel, eyes half closed, but never truly resting. Every time the pup twitched in sleep, Ranger's ear would perk and he would lift his head, nose leaning to the basket's edge, confirming, always confirming, that she was all right. Across the small table, Sarah sat with a mug of tea she had not touched. The steam had thinned, cooled, and vanished entirely, but she still cradled the cup between her palms, staring at it as though it held answers written in its swirl. Mark sat opposite her, hands wrapped around his own mug, eyes thoughtful and heavy. He had changed out of his dress uniform into a thick flannel shirt and jeans, but the day still clung to him like an invisible weight. It was Sarah who finally broke the silence. Tell me about that night. Her voice was quiet, but it carried a tremor of urgency beneath. They said it was a blizzard. They said he didn't make it back to the truck. Mark took a deep breath and began speaking, not to explain just the facts, but to breathe life back into the last moments of his friend's story. They were tracking a call about gunfire near the ridgeline, he began. Jack insisted on taking Ranger. Visibility dropped faster than anyone expected. I was a few miles back with the backup squad. He stared into his tea, as if watching old images play there. Radio contacts started cutting in and out. Snow static, wind distortion. Last thing I heard clearly was Jack's voice. He said, "We've got something here. I'm not leaving it." Sarah's hands tightened around the cup. His voice. Hearing it repeated made it real, in a way she didn't feel prepared for. Mark continued, voice low. "When we reached the area, it was like stepping into a frozen grave. We found the patrol truck stuck, driver's side door open, snow packed inside. Ranger was there, barking, pacing, dragging at my sleeve, trying to pull me toward this clump of trees. He swallowed hard. We found Jack half buried in snow, curled around his chest like he was still trying to shield something from the wind." Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, eyes wet again. But she kept listening, because now she needed this part of the story. "Ranger was pressed against him when we pulled them out. We thought Jack had just been trying to shield his torso for warmth. None of us even imagined he was hiding a living heartbeat inside his coat." Mark nodded toward the basket. "Her." The little pup twitched, as if echoing the conclusion. For a moment Sarah couldn't speak. She simply looked down, breathing unevenly, letting the weight of that picture settle. Jack, in a storm, wrapped around a tiny life. Ranger, shielding them both fighting the snow until one of them couldn't anymore. Mark's voice gentled. "We brought him down the mountain. The medics tried, but it was too late." Sarah nodded slowly. She had heard this before, but not like this. Not with the truth threaded through it. Mark continued, eyes dim. "At the funeral home, they prepared him. We were all grieving, distracted. That room was warm. The coffin wasn't sealed until right before the viewing. There must have been enough air, barely, but enough." She held on. Ranger lifted his head and pressed his muzzle gently into Sarah's leg. She reached down and stroked his head, fingers trembling through rough fur. "You knew," Sarah whispered to the dog. "You tried to tell someone. Even earlier." Ranger blinked slowly, almost human in comprehension. Mark nodded. "He was whining at the door of the prep room the whole morning before the service. I thought it was just grieving. I kept him out until the last minute." He clenched his jaw. "Turns out, he was still on duty." That made Sarah laugh softly through an ache in her throat, a mixture of sorrow and admiration. "He always takes everything personally, just like Jack." After a moment, Sarah got up and crossed to the basket. She sat on the floor beside it, knees bent, chin resting on the rim. Ranger shifted to make space for her, just barely. Sarah gently lifted the pup, holding her tiny body against her chest. The warmth of life there was a fragile miracle. "What do I call you?" she murmured. "Your father already picked out a name once. Will he choose again?" Mark raised an eyebrow. "Father?" She smiled faintly. "Jack. He brought her home, the hard way." Mark nodded slowly. Sarah glanced down at the pup. Her voice softened. "He said, if we ever had a dog of our own, not on duty, he liked the name Lila. Said it sounded like a light turning on in a dark room." The pup squirmed, just a little, nose brushing Sarah's collarbone. "Then Lila it is," Mark said. Ranger made a low, approving sound, almost a rumble, his tail thumping once against the floor. Sarah let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. "Welcome home, Lila." The room warmed with something close to relief, something almost like healing beginning to take root. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the pup sleep, listening to the storm rasp against the windows. Eventually Mark said, "Do you want us to stay a while longer? Or—" Sarah looked up at him, not as a grieving widow now, but as someone beginning to move forward. "You should go," she said gently. "But Ranger stays." Ranger looked up sharply, ears lifting. Mark chuckled. "I figured as much." Sarah stroked Ranger's head. "Jack trusted him, and I trust him too. Lila needs him?" Ranger thumped his tail again. Mark rose from his chair, pulling on his thick winter coat and scarf. He paused by the door. "If you need anything, call." "I will." He hesitated, then said quietly, "Jack would be proud of you, Sarah." She met his eyes and smiled, small, tired, but real. "Maybe someday I'll feel that too." When the door opened, a blast of icy wind swirled in. Mark slipped out into the white darkness, steady and sure. Sarah locked the door, leaned against it for a moment, listening to the storm fade behind thick walls. She returned to the little basket where Lila now slept once more. Ranger lay beside it still, vigilant. Sarah sank down beside them. "You're not just a dog," she whispered into Ranger's fur. "You're the last piece of Jack I get to keep." Ranger leaned against her, heavy and warm and solid, and in that little kitchen, with the storm howling beyond the walls and the sleeping pup curled inside the blanket, something in Sarah finally loosened. Not all the way, but enough for hope to slip in. The world outside could stay frozen, but inside, a new winter story had begun. Winter did not leave Maplewood Ridge quickly. It retreated in slow, stubborn stages, like a wounded beast backing out of a doorway. The banks of snow that had once towered like white ramparts grew shorter by inches rather than the feet. Slush replaced frost on the sidewalks. The river began to groan and crack as sheets of ice surrendered to darker water beneath. But inside the Callahan home, the change of seasons was measured differently. Not in weather patterns, but in heartbeats, habits, and unexpected laughter. Lila grew fast. At first she was a fragile bundle. Tiny paws, floppy ears, and eyes that stayed closed for nearly 2 weeks. Sarah fed her formula with a syringe, waking every 3 hours at night. On the third night, exhausted and half asleep, Sarah blinked to find Ranger already beside the basket, nudging her arm gently, as if reminding her, it's time. He had become the unofficial alarm clock of survival. When Lila finally opened her eyes, a soft, cloudy blue, Sarah gasped with a small, startled joy. Ranger simply licked the pup's nose, then lay beside her basket again, as if checking off a milestone in a duty roster. By 6 weeks, Lila began to wobble across the kitchen floor. First 3 steps, then 10, then a chaotic scramble of paws and ears that sent both Sarah and Ranger scrambling to guide her away from chair legs, table corners, unattended slippers, charging cables, and Mark's boots when he visited. Mark became a regular presence at the house. An evening coffee, a quick check-in after a shift, sometimes an hour sitting on the sofa, while Ranger dozed across his feet and Lila chewed clumsily on a rubber toy. Mark never overstayed, never crowded, and Sarah appreciated that more than she could say. The ache of Jack's absence still appeared suddenly sometimes, sharp as ice. She'd glance at the coat on the hook by the door and briefly forget he wasn't coming home to wear it. She'd hear a siren in the distance and feel her pulse spike. She'd go to pour 2 mugs of coffee instead of 1. But the grief that once filled every inch of the house had changed shape. Now it shared space with something else, something gentler. Lila brought chaos, Ranger brought order. Between them, Sarah found balance. By spring, Lila was leggy, bright-eyed, and full of tumbling enthusiasm. She was a deep golden tan with a developing saddle of black along her back that would one day darken into Ranger's striking contrast. Her ears stubbornly refused to stand upright simultaneously. One often drooped, while the other leaned halfway, giving her a perpetually quizzical look that made Sarah laugh even on hard days. Ranger, meanwhile, aged gracefully into a quiet mentor. He corrected Lila with low rumbles when she misbehaved, chewing furniture, tugging at clothing, nosing the trash can lid. He taught by example, where to sit during meals, how to wait at the door, how to greet people gently. Sarah didn't always realize the teaching was happening, but Mark saw it clearly. One crisp morning in early spring, he leaned against the doorway to the kitchen, sipping coffee. "He's running her like a rookie," he said, nodding to Ranger. The older dog was demonstrating how to sit and wait for a treat, a process in which Lila repeatedly sat, then popped impatiently back up, then sat again. Sarah laughed. "He loves having someone to boss around." Mark grinned. Ranger was always more of a sergeant than a soldier. For all the home learning, Ranger still had active duty with the department. The chief, Bill Simmons, was a broad, barrel-chested man with a close-cut beard and a voice that could stop a bar fight with one syllable. Though tough, he had a soft spot for the K-9 team. On more than one occasion he had said, "That dog's not just an asset, he's an officer." Still, something had shifted in Ranger since Jack's death, not in skill or discipline, but in purpose. One afternoon at the station, Mark unloaded Ranger from the patrol truck. Lila, grown enough for outings, trotted beside him with a little harness Sarah had bought. Members of the station, cops hardened by years of grim calls, lit up at the sight of the pup. Even Chief Simmons bent to scratch her ears. "Look at you," he rumbled. "You gonna be a K-9 too someday?" Lila wagged enthusiastically and attempted to lick his beard. Someone laughed. "She's already breached protocol. No licking the chief before 9 a.m. Mark watched Ranger from the corner of his eye. The older dog wasn't jealous. Instead, he seemed quietly proud, like a teacher presenting a promising recruit. The chief straightened, eyes thoughtful. "You know, Delaney, if there was ever a dog who deserved to write his own assignment, it's that one." Mark raised an eyebrow. "He already did," he said. "He assigned himself to the Callahan home. He helps us when he feels like it." The chief nodded with surprising softness. "That's good enough for me." Without any ceremony or paperwork, Ranger's role shifted, no longer solely a working K-9. He became something else, something Maplewood Ridge didn't have a name for. A bridge, a link, a living continuation of Jack's devotion. At home, Sarah noticed it too. On nights when grief returned, the quiet ache of missing Jack, she would sit on the floor near the fireplace. Ranger would lean his warm, steady weight against her side. Lila, still too young to understand loss, but full of instinctive empathy, would climb halfway into her lap and nuzzle beneath her chin. Sarah would wipe tears with the back of her hand and whisper, "You two have no respect for personal space." And somehow, that made her laugh. Ranger also developed a surprising protectiveness over both of them. If a stranger came to the door, delivery driver, meter reader, salesman, Ranger would stand between the newcomer and the two females of the Easy house, silent, ready, but never overreacting. Only once did he growl, and that was when a pushy insurance agent tried stepping into the doorway uninvited. "Easy," Sarah told Ranger, but her voice held gratitude. Lila learned from that too. She mimicked Ranger's stance, standing beside him, but pressed shoulder to shoulder like a child hiding behind a parent. And then came the day that proved Ranger's new mission. It was a late afternoon in early summer. Sarah and Lila were out in the yard. Mark had stopped by after shift, uniform shirt open at the neck, sunglasses dangling from one hand. Ranger was lying in the shade near the porch steps. Then, sudden screaming from the house next door. A high, panicked sound. A child's voice. Mark and Ranger reacted simultaneously. Ranger was on his feet before Mark could even register the direction. A toddler, little Emma Walsh, age 3, had wandered onto the thawing riverbank behind the Walsh house. The soil was soft, still saturated with melted ice. Emma's tiny foot had sunk into a muddy hollow and become caught. The river's current, deceptively playful, snatched at the edge of her dress and splashed perilously near her calves. Sarah gasped. "Oh, God!" Mark sprinted. Ranger sprinted faster. Lila burst forward, attempting to follow, but Sarah caught her and held tight. "Stay!" Ranger reached the child first. His body blocked the river. His stance pinned Emma safely on the bank. He lowered his head, nudging her back from the edge. Mark arrived seconds later, scooping Emma into his arms. Her parents came running, frantic, tears in their eyes. "Thank you, thank you, thank..." They were saying it to Mark, but their eyes were on Ranger. Later, as quiet settled again over the yards and houses and fences, Sarah stroked Ranger's ears and whispered, "You're not just guarding us. You're guarding this whole town." Ranger closed his eyes, leaning into her hand. That night, Sarah lit a single candle by Jack's photo on the dining room shelf. The picture that once tore her heart open with pain now stirred something else, something gentler. "I think you sent him back to us," she whispered. Lila lay at her feet, Ranger at her side, and in that fragile, steady moment, she realized Jack's last act of love had become Ranger's continuing purpose. He wasn't just a K9 anymore. He was a guardian of home, of family, of memory, and of the small, fragile future called Lila. 5 years passed, quietly and steadily, like snow melting off eaves in springtime. Maplewood Ridge cycled through its seasons: snowbound winters, muddy thaws, green-drenched summers, orange ember autumns, and back again. The town evolved in ways small and large. A new bakery opened on Cedar Street. Old Mr. Callahan's grocery finally switched to digital registers after 40 years. Children who once toddled grew into swift-legged runners, and among the familiar faces of the community were 2 generations of German shepherds and 1 human girl who had grown alongside them. Lila Callahan, now 6 years old, was a child with bright hazel eyes and long brown hair that curled at the ends like Sarah's used to. She had her mother's earnest gentleness and a quiet, thoughtful nature that made adults notice her in ways they couldn't quite articulate. She was pale-skinned like Sarah, slender, always in motion but never chaotic, full of curiosity and kindness, with a laugh that rang like a bell in an empty church. Her namesake, Lila the dog, was now fully grown. Her coat was a warm mix of tan and black, more golden than Ranger's deeper saddle, with eyes that glowed amber brown. She had grown into her ears, which now stood sharp and symmetrical. Her gait was confident, but her temperament was a little softer than Ranger's, less soldier, more nurturer. It wasn't unusual to find her following human Lila from room to room, tail swishing like a feather duster, leaning against her gently whenever she sensed sadness or hesitation. And Ranger, though his gait had slowed, still carried himself with the quiet nobility of a venerable guardian. His muzzle had turned silver white. The fur around his eyes had faded, but his posture remained straight, his eyes alert, his presence steady, a living statue of loyalty. Ranger had entered the stage of doghood where every movement is purposeful, not because energy is abundant, but because experience guides where it should be spent. Sarah had changed too, though in subtler ways. At 37, she carried warmth rather than grief in her eyes. The shadows of loss still lived there, but they were smaller, tucked respectfully into corners rather than dominating her gaze. She still worked as a school counselor. Parents trusted her. Children adored her. And she had become, in the quiet language of the town, the woman who raised her daughter and 2 shepherds with a heart wide enough for all 3. Mark remained part of their lives, more than just a friend. He had attended birthdays, fixed leaky faucets, helped shovel snow-choked sidewalks when winter came early, and taught Lila, the girl, how to ride her bike without training wheels. Still, he never assumed a place. He never tried to replace Jack. Whatever he felt, respect, affection, maybe more, he held with patience and care, allowing the household to remain what it had become, a family built partly from love, partly from memory, and partly from the unspoken promises of one noble dog. The spring ceremony at the police station had been planned for months. Nothing extravagant. Maplewood Ridge wasn't a town of speeches and fanfare, but the officers and citizens alike had agreed that Ranger deserved a permanent place on the station wall. That bright spring afternoon, Sarah stood in front of her mirror, adjusting a simple navy blouse. Lila stood nearby, carefully looping a faded blue ribbon, her favorite, around the neck of grown Lila the dog. "Almost done," the little girl murmured, tongue poking from the corner of her smile. "Hold still." Lila the dog tolerated the fashioning with saintly patience. "There," Lila said, stepping back with pride. "Perfect." Ranger stood watching from the living room doorway, tail swaying slightly in approval, but also perhaps in memory. Sarah knelt and clipped his leash gently. "Ready, old boy?" she asked softly. Ranger huffed, leaning his head briefly into her hand. Yes, he was ready. They walked to the station together, Sarah holding Ranger's leash, Lila holding Lila's leash, Mark joining them halfway down the street. Inside, officers stood respectfully along the walls. A few citizens had come as well. Emma Walsh, now 8, waved shyly to Ranger from behind her mother. Old Sergeant Pendleton, even he had softened, wearing a small, grudging smile beneath his mustache. The chief cleared his throat, voice booming with its usual granite authority, but softened at the edges. Maplewood Ridge has always relied on its officers. But sometimes, he glanced at Ranger, we lean on those who don't wear badges, at least not in the traditional sense. Warm laughter trickled through the room. Today we honor one of our finest. He served with discipline, courage, heart, and bark. More laughter. He saved lives, bridged grief, and reminded all of us what loyalty truly means. He nodded to Mark. Mark stepped forward, unwrapped a cloth covering a framed photo, and hung it on a freshly painted patch of wall. A ripple ran through the crowd. Soft gasps, smiles, murmured awe. The photograph showed a laughing 6-year-old girl, grass stains on her knees, arms flung tightly around the necks of 2 German shepherds, one bright, youthful, joyful, the other dignified, older, muzzle frosted like morning snow. Ranger and Lila. Below the picture was a brass plaque, K9 Ranger, loyalty that outlived the storm, and beneath it, hand-etched, sometimes a bark is not just a sound, it is a promise kept. Sarah's throat tightened. She placed one hand over her heart. Little Lila looked up at Ranger, then at the plaque. She traced Ranger's name with a single fingertip. Did he really save me? She asked softly. Every adult in the room went quiet, not out of awkwardness, but out of reverence for the truth of the answer. Sarah knelt beside her daughter. Yes, she whispered. He saved you, and you saved us. Ranger looked at her, present, steadfast, timeless. Outside, patches of snow still clung to the mountain crests, reminders of winters that once buried the world. But down in town, the air was mild, children played, windows were open, and life was unfolding with gentle momentum. Jack Callahan was gone, but his last act, protecting a small life, had become a legacy that changed the lives of many. Later that evening, when they returned home, Sarah placed a new photo on the mantel, the same one from the station wall. She set it beside the old framed image of Jack and Ranger. She rested her fingers lightly on the glass. You kept your last promise, she whispered. Ranger lay beside her feet, eyes half closed. Lila sprawled on the carpet, head resting on grown Lila's back. And in the hushed twilight of that small living room, Sarah realized something profound. Love had not ended when Jack died. It had multiplied. It had grown new roots. It had chosen new forms. It had found new guardians. And it would continue, as long as loyalty walked on 4 legs beside them. This story reminds us that God's miracles do not always arrive with thunder or bright signs. Sometimes they come quietly through the courage of an officer who refuses to give up, through the loyalty of a dog who keeps watching over a fragile life, and through the small, everyday moments when hope rises just when we feel ready to fade. In our own lives, we face storms too, moments when we feel tired, uncertain, or alone. But God walks beside us even then. He guides our steps, protects our families, and sends help in ways we often recognize only afterward. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs encouragement today. Leave a comment to tell us your thoughts, and remember to subscribe to the channel so we can continue spreading stories of faith, courage, and love. May God bless you and your loved ones with peace, protection, and strength wherever you are watching from. And if you believe in the gentle miracles He sends every day, type Amen in the comments.